Stick Figures by Jay Wilburn. It was a hell of a thing for her to watch him die in front of her. More than just dying, he was coming apart, going from solid to flat, crude lines against the stone and dirt, less than a person, nothing but memory over this once this was over. She thought they had missed him with their dark magic this time, but obviously she'd been wrong. Faye Dare didn't exactly hold him as he expired. She was too afraid of the magic of the alien creatures leaking over and infecting her as well. Did she love Paul Mall? That was a complicated thing. As far as she knew, they might be the last two of their kind left in the world. Not just the last of their tribe, that was a certainty, but they could be the last two of their species in existence. This might well be extinction playing out before her eyes. It hardly seemed possible, but maybe it was inevitable. What would the monsters do with themselves with no people left to hunt? Hopefully they would turn on each other. But did she love him? She clung to the idea of him out of fear, out of no better options. She wouldn't touch him now, though, and not ever again. Faye looked away from him. His legs were gone already, one of his arms as well, the features of his face flattened. She expected he might be gone by the time she looked back, but she had to be sure they hadn't found her, not yet. A few spits of stone held up the last chunks of powdery roof on what had been a usable structure a few generations before she was born. These ruins could have been houses or areas of commerce and trade. Her own ancestors might have built them, or maybe those unearthly ancestors who preceded the aliens in this land. All of those people were dead and gone regardless, and Paul Mall joined them. She was alone for now. He wasn't quite gone by the time she looked down upon him again, but his limbs were gone, along with most of his body. A smaller negative impression of him scarred the ground. She had seen these figure markers across ruins, caves, and rock faces throughout the land. Her own parents, her siblings, the rest of her tribe had become these things at the hands of the monsters who now ruled the land and all the useless ruins of dead civilizations. Paul's chest vanished into the ground, and what was left of his face became an empty circle drawn in the dirt where he used to be, where his life ended. She wondered if because he had become a stick figure in the dirt that the rain would wash him away quicker. She reached out to see if her fingertips might smear his drawing, but then she pulled away in fear of the dark magic would find her and take her too as a result. Footsteps, heavy footsteps from numbers of feet, approached her. Faye ran and ducked into a washout beyond the ruins where she crouched. She had just started to catch her breath again before they arrived, but Faye didn't believe she could outrun these hunters forever. So for now she hid. They entered the space where Paul had vanished and stalked out to the disturbed ground where the drawing marked his passing. They laughed in their high hyena bray that hurt her ears, even when they did so quietly. They were tracking, and she was only a mere 50 to 60 feet away at most. When one of them raised his tiny snout to sniff the air, she held her breath and dared not to move even a little. They were monsters, all of them. They were destroyers of worlds, horrors to look upon. Though each one was a different height, they were all tall and impossibly slender in comparison to real people such as herself. Their pale skin pulled so tight against their rail-like bodies that they appeared to be deformed skeletons covered in tight, discolored leather. They had muscle, but nothing compared to her kind, the warriors they had destroyed. If not for their dark magic, they could be beaten to death even by someone as weak as her. You'd be able to see their bones snap under their leathery skin. Small heads with even smaller features, like people, but also nothing like them, made her shiver every time she saw them or thought of them. Being this close was death, and she might be their final victim. Hairless and pale, their beady eyes scanned the area. They knew she was still around, and they wanted to finish her off too. They weren't strong, and they weren't particularly fast either, but they seemed to never tire. They persisted until better people collapsed before them. They weren't strong, but they could use weapons, and of course, they could turn anyone into a stick figure. The alien creatures moved away from the line drawing of Paul at a diagonal from her hiding spot. Before they were completely gone, she had to finally exhale. Faye took care to draw breath slowly and silently through the shaking of her body. Finally, she rose from the shallow ditch to make her way off their search path and into cover in the other direction. Maybe it was pointless, but there had to be a reason to go on, even if it was just the drive not to die at their slender, evil hands. An arrow skipped across the ground off to her left just before another bounced off a sliver of stone from one of the ruined walls to her right. Faye ran and they followed. Arrows were an old kind of magic that even her people could wield, but they would, of course, bring her down if she allowed herself to be hit. With no real hope or faith in herself, she weaved between more ruins and thickets of trees and overgrown bushes. No more arrows flew, but she heard them charging behind her. She was so exhausted that her advantages of speed and strength were now neutralized. She heard the crackle of rising energy that represented their dark magic, the stuff that would turn her to lines. This was nothing. This was nothing to play with, because a glancing strike of the stuff had done Paul in and left her to survive on her own as long as she might. At a tall, rusty pole that protruded high into the air, stabbing at the sky, she cut a hard left and fled down a slope between more ruins that were mostly buried in the uneven ground of dried muds from a previous flash flood. Being washed away might be a blessing. Movement off to her right drew her attention and froze her in place. It was the wrong reaction to being chased, and was the reason that prey so often fell to predators given enough time. She assumed they had flanked her and led her into a trap. That might explain the missed arrows. However, she found herself alone with nothing to her right. There were a few stick figures against the top remains of one partially buried ruin. The things that had once been people were frozen in mid-run. It looked like a scene of hunters, but she knew these portraits were those of the hunted. The renewed sound of crackling energy set her into motion, and she dodged into the underbrush to continue her retreat. She was now heading back in the relative direction from which she had come, but the plants provided some cover as she wound downward with the steep slope of the land. She couldn't hear the monster's feet, but the rustle of plants told her they were not far behind, and they weren't giving up. Twice her feet almost went out from under her as she ran headlong down a slope too steep for running. But she kept upright and pressed on blind through the leaves, pulling at her face. The third time she tripped, the ground vanished under her, and she tumbled down through an eroded rut in the earth. She could hardly enjoy the coolness of the dark space as she took a bruising on the way. Finally, she rolled away from the dirt and clay walls out onto the cracked tile of a proper floor. The ancient flooring was cool to the touch and sharp as it sliced into her hands, arms, and knees. Faye sprung to her feet, ignoring the pain as she looked through the shadowy space. There was not much left of the signs above the small inlet caves that had once been buildings. She couldn't have read them even if they'd remained. She got the impression that this had once been a grand marketplace. Harsh beams of light spilled in from breaks in the ground above. Animal skeletons and the mummified remains of small mammals who had fallen in here like her cowered dead in the corners, where they likely perished alone, hungry and thirsty. That did not bode well. Light-colored dirt cascaded down behind her and over the tiles as the monsters followed. Faye broke into a run through the canyon pass of this preserved place. Every canyon had 2 openings, she told herself, as she covered the long distance before the monsters could arrive. Those animal skeletons should have been her first clue, though. She was wrong as she came to a stop before a sheer wall at the end of the passage. The patterns of the tiles and their dulled colors climbing up the sheer face would have been lovely in the spilling light if she weren't about to be taken apart in this, her final resting place. She turned to see their slender silhouettes. They no longer ran, as they now had her pinned like the animal they considered her to be, a dumb animal like every other that fell in here. Their chests heaved for breath. Each time she could see the outline of bones in their fragile rib cages. If they got close enough, she could see their beating hearts. These killers were hideous, and they'd be the last thing she ever saw. Motion to her sides drew her attention. There was nowhere for more of these things to hide, but she looked anyway. Faye considered that she might be going mad with fear. There was really no other explanation for stick figures to be moving along these walls like they were still alive. Then a few of them ran off the wall, and along the flat floor. The dark lines of their bodies rose and fell with the bumps of the remaining tile. Faye backed into the last wall behind her to keep the shapes from passing under her feet. The alien things that had turned all her people into these stick figures now spread out before her. A few lifted their common spears and bows. Others turned their hands to glow with the crackling energy that would be her undoing. Then the stick figures charged at the slender monsters across every flat surface. They were distracted by the motion as well, and spoke to one another in their hooting and clicking language. No hyena laughs now. They tried to stab at the ground. A few fired straight down, breaking their arrows. Faye wasn't sure what more these moving drawings could do, if they were even real, until the monsters started to scream. A few of them fell with satisfying thuds. Then their bodies were torn open, spilling their bright red blood and exposing their fragile bones, seconds before those bones snapped with their collapsing bodies. The stick figures swam over the bright surface of the spreading blood to continue their attack. Others made to flee as if forgetting Faye completely, but they didn't get far. The ones bearing the magic fired it into the floor under them. Tiles exploded up and out in clouds of dry dust. Some of the figures broke apart into separate lines. As they did, forms of their old bodies rose ghostly from the ground, as if using the dust to partially manifest themselves for an instant. But then they were gone. Most survived in their strange lined form and continued the assault. One of the alien magicians turned its glowing hands toward Faye. The monster showed its tiny rounded teeth and threw the power off its hands at her. Faye dove and paid in pain upon landing on the abused ground. The wall burst behind her, and more tile cascaded down where she'd been standing. It cut her shoulder, and then her shoulder burned as if set afire. The magician fell and was torn apart before he could power up again. Soon the canyon of ancient ruins grew silent, except for Faye coughing on the clouds of dust that had nowhere to go. The stick figures spread out from the field of gore. They formed a half circle around Faye as well. She was free to go, but knew this was far from the only tribe of hunters looking to end her and her kind with her. But they had won for now. Could she figure a way up that the other animals trapped down here had failed to find? There was one little typo, so I'm going to need to fix that. Had failed to find. Could the stick figures help her again? She made to lift herself off the floor, but her injured arm betrayed her. As she started to roll over, she realized she could not pull that arm away from the floor. She was afraid to look, but really had no other choice. Her greatest fear unfolded before her eyes. Her arm had turned into one thin line drawn on the floor in the damaged tile. Her shoulder followed it from the third dimension down into the second. They had gotten a piece of her after all, and that's all it took. Faye cried. It wasn't from pain or even fear of what was to come. It was just so unfair. They had defeated the monsters this time. It was only this small battle, but they had done it even after being turned into drawings. They had fought back. They had won. But now, if Faye was the last, it might be over. She never blacked out or appeared to die as Paul, and everyone before her had done. Her legs and her body turned to flat lines as she transformed from the curse of the dark magic. Lastly, her head became a circle, and she was one of the stick figures like the ones that surrounded her. Thoughts didn't die away in her drawn form, but they slowed terribly. She wondered if any of those flat warriors had been Paul or her family. She wondered if she could move along the ground like the others had for a while a moment ago. maybe they could still destroy the aliens for what they had done. For now, she waited to see.